Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Now, I've raided at a cutting-edge level non-stop ever since Siege of Orgrimmar back in Mist of Pandaria, and lately raiding for me has just kind of been losing its luster. Ever since Sanctum of Domination, the middle of Shadowlands, raiding to me has not been as big of a joy and as big of a drive and motivator to the point that I'm insanely excited for every raid tier. It's true, I am looking forward to Aberrus. I'm very positive about what I've seen thus far out of the raid, and I'm hoping it's able to break this streak. But I wanted to talk about my previous experiences with things like Vault of the Incarnates, with Sanctum of Domination and Sylvanas, and even all these old raids like you're seeing out of Gul'dan, in terms of what has really brought me a lot of joy and a lot of love for raiding, and what recently has sort of just been bringing down some of that enjoyment, in my opinion. One of the biggest things, I think, to sort of start has been this very rare loot, which is once again being brought into the Aberrus raid. It is these pieces that are insanely good. They're almost always trinkets, but there's also a cloak which steals secondary stats from your allies to empower yourself. These like very rare pieces almost feel like a linchpin to like force people to get back into raiding. Now, of course, back in the day, there was no M+, and the only way to be able to gear yourself in PvE was to raid. And you wanted more gear, you had to go into the higher difficulty, and it was just that simple and that transactional. Now, with the convenience of M+, yeah, it's totally understandable that people want to be able, who have inflexible jobs that require them to be on at all hours of the day, people that have families, who have other hobbies, other things they want to do all the time, can't commit to even 2 days a week where they have to show up at for 3 hours for very specific times. People's time is exceedingly valuable these days, and it's absolutely understandable. Having the point of emphasis be, let's go get this very rare piece of gear, and that's why you should want to raid, feels like just the absolute wrong idea to incentivize people to do that, instead of being at a point where it says, you should want to do this because it is just so much fun to be able to properly interact with. And I felt like I was at a point, and granted I was in college and had a lot less going on, that there was just nothing I wanted to do more than just raid with my friends and just play the game at a high level and continue to improve myself and continue to kill bosses as quickly as I possibly could. And I think there is a bit that has just been missing over the years, and I think a lot of it comes from end bosses and the overall difficulty of a lot of the different raid encounters that we're experiencing. For one thing, getting 20 people online all the time to be able to commit to grinding out hundreds of pulls on different boss fights is always going to be a massive, massive challenge. We're even seeing, you know, out of things like Classic WoW, where it's like, hey guys, we can get on really quick, kill off all the bosses, and then we're done for the week. Makes a pretty massive difference when it comes to a game that can be as time-intensive and grindy as all hell as something like Classic. But what I've really enjoyed over the years has been these encounters that did a great mix of being sort of showy as an end boss, but also keeping you engaged with what's going on. Gul'dan, probably one of the best examples of it, because every single phase seemed to involve everybody in some way or another. There were phases where healers just had to turbo blast. There were phases where healers had to use extra action buttons to help people break chains as they got knocked back so they could properly break the chains, mitigate the damage, and survive. There was multiple different times where you could have those life-saving life grips where your own mobility cooldowns got incredibly large amounts of value, and it was just a very flexible encounter that also was taking place on the roof of the Nighthold at the very top of the raid, as sort of this culmination of all of these quests and all of the characters that you've met along the way. So from like a showy perspective, from the lore perspective, but also from the gameplay, it sort of did all of those things extremely well. Now when I think back to like Raszageth or the Jailer, two bosses which we did not get a chance to test on any difficulty before they were released, I feel like this lack of polish that has existed for a lot of these raid encounters we've seen recently comes very heavily from not testing those bosses on heroic difficulty at least. And as a result, one of the major things I would say is bring back that heroic testing. Part of it is coming from being able to like clean up phases and make them more consistent and make sure there's like a steadier stream of like progression. As we saw out of like Raszageth, for example, there was not steady progression whatsoever for that encounter, where massive amounts of the wipes and the massive amount of the overall attempts were just taking place in phase 1 over and over and over again. Whereas something like Gul'dan, it felt like there was always something else around the corner that you had to be able to progress on. If you played on Sire Denathrius, I think it was also very much the same way, is that it shared a ton of mechanics from Heroic, and it shared a lot of the same vibe from Heroic, but the little additions in terms of the named NPCs that you had to kill off, how you had to kill them off, the inversion at the end of the phase, the final phase that you had to be able to deal with, all made a slight but very noticeable difference in terms of your gameplay and added a lot of additional challenges into the mix for teams of really all difficulties to actually contend with. When I was talking about some of the difficulty curve, looking at Liquid's polls on Razageth, for example, you can just see how many of these attempts are just sitting in phase 1, trying to make sure that you're able to survive. Part of the problem with this is the fact that they can't really make these other later phases harder, or they can't like let them through into phase 2, see how they do, and then crank up the difficulty of phase 2. That's just never been how they've tuned end bosses. And so there's a lot of pressure that, okay, we'll let them get a little bit further. We'll let them get a little bit further. We saw it out of Ashara maybe like 5 years ago, where there was sort of like steady nerfs that were happening to the encounter on a mythic difficulty because you weren't exactly sure if people were able to find the damage to kill off like 3 of the lieutenant mobs that Ashara would spawn, put shields up, crack the shield, and then kill the mob quickly and move on to like the next one. There was a number of those things that are always naturally going to happen, but there also was not an insane first phase that just destroyed you all the time. In fact, that first phase was kind of just the RP phase, and we realized that it was, and we kind of knew that it was because we got a chance to test it. And we got a chance to say, oh, here's this slight difficulty that gets raised, and then it gets harder, and a little harder, and a little harder. I think Razageth on a variety of difficulties is sort of this, okay guys, just living it into the last phase and we'll win. And those are a lot less satisfying, especially when I look back at these other phases, where you go into a secret phase with Gul'dan, embodying the spirit of Illidan, and you have no idea what's happening. You have no clue. It doesn't need to be this extreme, mind you. I think N'Zoth's secret phase was a really good example where you kind of just like, you go down, you kill some dudes, you come back up, and it's fine. It doesn't need to actually be the most insane and crazy involved thing that you'd ever seen. But finding those ways that these extra phases in encounters and these mythic phases that we haven't been able to see before can add a slight bit of extra difficulty, just like we saw at a Sire Denathrius, are always a very positive thing to add into the mix. Now, that doesn't always mean that healers are going to be sitting there blasting healing. As much as I would love that, and as much as you guys know, I would absolutely love to be sitting here just payphone jamming tons of healing to my heart's content. I think this fight with Mythic Archimonde, again, this is 7 years ago, so excuse the quality, was a really good example of this. You'd have phases where Infernals would crash down from the sky and there'd be massive healing, but also, see this right here? That is red chakra. You'd like switch stances as a holy priest back in the day. Switch into red chakra and started blasting some smites into this source of chaos to prevent it from knocking our tank JJ Mackie off of the platform, right? That was a really interesting phase where it was saying, hey, you can either heal him and heal your allies who are taking extra damage to slow the beam and make sure your tank stays on the platform, or you can start cranking some extra damage to be able to help your team. It's a focused area that's very important for everybody to add damage and everybody to have an easier time with the fight. And then we can sort of draw you back into a point of healing again. And I think that those phases are always really important when it comes to dealing with end bosses. You saw it as well with like Kil'jaeden, which kind of, a lot more recent of course, which had a nice mix of dodging around mechanics and dealing with sort of like a bullet hell, which you'll see in just a moment. But also, it came from healing up NPCs and healing up ads, which is something which has been extremely hit or miss over the years when it comes to mechanics. When you had fights like Kael'thas or fights like Sulong back in like Terrace of the Endless Springs, where some of them pretty good, some of them extremely awkward. And I think that those are some of those mechanics that can always be executed well, or it can be a little bit janky, but it also comes down to testing and being able to see what works and what doesn't work from an early point of view. And when it looks to like the Sarkareth fight, the final boss of Aberrus, we have no idea. And lately, I don't think the score is in favor of this no testing scenario. And I think when they can't sort of elevate the difficulty in these different phases, you end up with some tremendous difficulty in 1 or 2 phases, like we saw at a Jailer and Razageth. And then, just like we saw out of the last phase of Jailer, and like we saw out of the last phase of Razageth, you just get to the end and you're basically home free. Yeah, you got to the point where the, 2 through 5 for the world, the highest end world guilds were just using Covenant abilities to bug the boss. It's like the most ridiculous stuff possible. Like, how is that even possible for an end boss to be killed? That should be just like a massive red flag on the side of Blizzard. That something like that could ever happen at all. When it came to fights like Argus, there was also just this wonderful lore sort of element with the entire raid dying. And so just having some things that are going to be showy is not necessarily bad, but I think that we have had some negative examples of these lengthy intermissions which don't really do anything, with like Sylvanas, where you're running across the chains and you're just kind of like wiping up some trash mobs. Your Gahoon, you're tossing orbs to each other so you can get him to pop out of his little hole in the wall and actually engage with us and actually fight with us. There's those things that just don't really feel like you're engaging with the boss. You're kind of just like doing a mechanic before you're able to move on and actually fight the encounter. And those were some of the more frustrating things that I've experienced over the years, where it feels like I'm not engaging with the boss. I'm just kind of like wandering around in the dark. Jaina also was a good example of wandering around in the dark with her intermission phase. But also, that first phase had about no healing to do, so healers were just shooting ballistas and engaging with enemy boats. That wasn't even the boss! Like, those are very clear frustrations that I guess I would have over the years. Now, enough about encounter design, because I could probably go on all day. My proposition, how they're going to be able to improve rating, let me break it down. 12 to 15 man, I think, is something that needs to happen from a long-term basis. I know it would bring mass chaos once again to the game. I experienced that firsthand when they went from 10 and 25 man to just 20 man mythic. It was mass chaos. It was mass hysteria. It was a mess. But I think in general, it's incredibly challenging to be able to get 20 players online. Another thing is definitely the difficulty curve. When it comes to the difficulty curve of boss fights, having almost 400 attempts for Razageth, meanwhile, you're having fights like, let's see, Broodkeeper taking 67, which is very similar to the 59 of Kurog, the 63 of Dathia, and you sort of have only 3 steps in the Vault of the Incarnates raid. You have the insanely difficult. Then you have the moderate to hard, the moderate to hard, the moderate to hard, and then you have Senarth, Teros, Tribal Council, and Aranog all dying in a handful of pulls. It's an incredibly polarizing experience for a raid group. And then it's not, hey, our next boss kill is right around the corner. It's, we have to go over this huge mountain to be able to get over the next hump in the road. And I think that's also not really a welcoming experience for players who are trying to get into raiding, who are also committing a lot of time to be online at the same point, the same time, to raid at a mythic level. It's a lot of time commitment for players, and I think it gets compounded by the fact that with M+, and the convenience of M+, why would you want to be in a position where you're grinding 300 or 400 attempts on a boss unless you really loved the content that you were doing? You can even see the graph in terms of active hours time. This is almost like 25 hours or something like that they're spending just grinding away on Razageth, right? And it's just a fraction of the time for everything else. Incredibly, incredibly frustrating to be able to add it into the mix. They would absolutely have to make sure that they're revamping if they wanted to do like 12 or 15 man. It'd be somewhere around that bracket. They'd have to be revamping, of course, tons of class utility, probably having to revamp how some of the fights are going to be working. But I would love to see them change around the overall difficulty for these encounters so that it actually seems like it is a decent step up along the way, and not having these massive deltas between the end boss consuming, like sucking literally like all the air out of raiding for the room, where it says over half of the time spent raiding the Vaults of the Incarnates is just one encounter. And most of that time is in phase 1. Absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely insanely frustrating to play with as a player. It's tough as like an officer, as a GM, to be able to get people to just sit there and prog with you and actually be invested in it and actually prog with you as you're going through it. We experienced the same thing in Sepulchre. Like, Vault is not an anomaly, Sepulchre had massive capstone bosses. You would have these, like, Skullx, and you go into Artificer Zymox, it's like a good step up in difficulty. And then you go to, like, Halandris. Right? Once you finish with Halandris, then you go to Anduin. And you have a couple little breaks, and you go on a Jailer. Right? These massive jumps in terms of difficulty serve nothing but to, like, turn people off from raiding and make things a lot more frustrating. Raiding, as much as I love it, as much as I love the challenge, they need to be able to set it up as a steadier step up in difficulty, and I think it's tremendously harder when they try to hide these things by not doing them on the public test realm. I gotta tell you, for those people who want the surprise, it's just like any movie spoiler. You don't have to be able to tune in. Nobody's forcing you to look at these things, and you're not even going to be able to see it on Mythic yet. But boy, are you going to see that raid encounter for the next 6 months, and it will not be as polished or not be as good, in my opinion, than a lot of the predecessors that we've seen thus far. I think we are 0 for 2, and I hope that I'm wrong with Sarkareth, and I hope that we're not having another boss that has incredibly jarring and polarizing phases, or a pull count that's lasting more than all the other boss encounters in the raid combined. I hope I'm wrong. But I hope that this at least emphasizes my point, as well as just talking about the sort of an incomplete look, that I think there's some things I really love with raiding, and I've really loved, but they've sort of just diminished over time. But let me know what you guys think. Make sure to subscribe to the stream, and I'll be back for more with our tier list coming up very soon. Thank you for watching, guys.